And we begin tonight with Iraq, where clashes have erupted between Iraqi special forces and Al-Qaeda-linked militants just outside the city of Fallujah. It's the latest outbreak in a standoff that's taken hold of the Sunni-dominated province of Anbar. According to the Associated Press, the fighting resulted from the capture of an army officer and 4 soldiers in the area just a day earlier. Also in the Anbar province earlier today, an Iraqi government airstrike killed 25 Al-Qaeda-linked militants. The clashes also followed a deadly attack in which a suicide bomber rammed his explosives-laden truck into a police station in the northern city of Kirkuk. The attack killed 2 people, wounding 55 more. In recent days, Iraqi security forces and allies from Sunni tribes have been battling militants to recapture 2 very strategic cities in the Anbar province, Fallujah and Ramadi. However, currently, the 2 cities are at least partially under control of Al-Qaeda. The latest infighting is seemingly a continuation of the heightened violence seen in 2013, a year that now marks the most bloodshed seen since 2006, when the U.S. military still had a presence in the country. According to the United Nations' latest figures, last year the violence claimed the lives of about 8,900 Iraqis. I spoke earlier with Austin Petersen, editor at thelibertarianrepublic.com. I first asked him if history is repeating itself in Iraq.
It sort of is. I mean, the idea that we were going to be able to govern Iraq in the long term was not tenable. Everyone knew that. We were hoping that Iraqi security forces were going to be able to step up and meet the challenge. But we have a problem that's a multi-pronged problem here. We have a problem of hearts and minds, and we have a military problem. It's very difficult to defend the Anbar province. It took the lives of 1,000 Americans, combat troops, to take the Anbar province. I think there was something like 68 troops killed in Fallujah, and the worst urban combat since Vietnam. So it's all about a matter of how we fight our military strategy. We're sort of still fighting these old first generation, second generation styles of warfare, and the way that terrorist groups work now, they're very decentralized, and so what they can do is they can move and they can change positions all over different parts of the country so that they can stay alive. And the way that we've been fighting our fights in the past, again, has always been to sort of strike an invasion route, try and set up diplomacy, and install a new government. But regime change didn't really work in Iraq, although the Al-Maliki government is there. It's highly unstable, and they don't really have the sort of mandate from their citizens that they require in order to govern that large of a country. Really, Iraq is 3 separate countries. There's the Sunnis, there's the Kurds, there's the Shia, and they have always been sort of at war with one another. So I think that the problem here lies in a misunderstanding of the Middle Eastern political situation, because the Americans try and look at everything in terms of first-generation war, like fighting something like World War II, where you would take over the enemy's province or you would take over their city, capital city, and believe that you would be able to change their hearts and minds. That's just not how this works. These are tribal regions. The Anbar province is an enormous region. It's 40 miles west of Baghdad, and it's sort of symbolic that it's so close to the capital, but there's no way to really win the hearts and minds of the people in the Anbar province just because you may have taken over Baghdad.
Right. It's indeed a very complicated situation. You know, the Secretary of State Kerry has said that we will not be sending troops into the region. However, the U.S. is accelerating deliveries of military equipment. Do you think the U.S. sort of has an obligation now and going forward to help Iraq militarily?
I don't see an obligation to help Iraq militarily. I do see an obligation to protect American national security interests. So to the extent that sending Hellfire missiles to the Iraqi government or sending the drones to Al-Maliki will increase the security of the United States, that remains to be questioned. So you really have to ask yourself, what are the interests of the United States? Are we trying to protect a fledgling democracy in Iraq, or are we really trying to protect American national security? I think that arguably the sending of more missiles and drones to the Maliki government isn't necessarily going to result in long-term stabilization. I think the long-term stabilization efforts are going to have to come through a diplomatic effort. And, you know, Secretary of State John Kerry is sort of acknowledging this. He's saying that, you know, we may be sending arms and weapons, but we're not going to be sending American troops in there, which will be interesting to play in the political season throughout 2016.
But the question is, you know, where do you draw the line? What are the implications of doing this now?
Well, the implications of doing this now just means that there will be more bloodshed. There will be more. Al-Maliki is absolutely going to try and hold on to power for as long as he can. This is how people operate in this region. So really what we're doing is we're trying to prop up a regime that has the backing of America. But whether or not that actually has anything to do with national security of the United States is really what's at question.
Right. Well, I want to take a look at something that former Congressman Ron Paul said in his weekly column. He said last month the U.S. shipped nearly 100 air-to-ground missiles to the Iraqi Air Force to help combat the surging Al-Qaeda. Ironically, the same Al-Qaeda groups the U.S. is helping the Iraqis combat are benefiting from the U.S. covert and overt war to overthrow Assad next door in Syria. Why can't the U.S. government learn from its mistakes? Do you think he has a point here?
He absolutely has a point. And one of the things that's interesting is that the Obama administration has signaled that not only will they not plan on sending more troops in, but President Obama has come out and said that he will actually vote to repeal the authorization of military force in Iraq, which is very big news. The first time that that happened was back in 2011 when Senator Rand Paul introduced that in the Senate, which it was struck down. The administration said that it wouldn't sign right now. So it appears that this may be something of a short-term strategy in the Obama administration to send these missiles now, but that it may not be a long-term commitment.
How significant is it? Is it more symbolic, or is it actually?
I don't really see it as that significant, to be quite fair, because the reality is that we had this agreement with them for a long time. If you look at what we did with Egypt, we stopped shipping certain arms to Egypt because of the strife that was going on down there. You can take a look at what happened in Syria. I think that the president right now has sort of been rocked back onto his heels from the inability to use the military force in Syria. So the administration may be taking these conciliatory steps and just saying, well, we have an obligation to provide them with arms and weapons, but there's no way that we can have a long-term agreement. And it seems as if they're signaling that they're not interested in any sort of a long-term engagement.
Right. Well, of course, Iraq borders Syria, and that's another highly contentious situation. You know, there's so much instability that's growing in the region as a whole. How do you think the international community should really be dealing with this as a threat going forward?
Well, I think really how they have to deal with this is they have to start to win the hearts and minds with a battle for what we call property rights, basic property rights. And that's one thing that hasn't been introduced to the discussion yet, is that the idea that people should be able to own their own property. And this is something that in the Middle East they haven't necessarily had a long tradition of. And I think in the United States we have this tradition of classical liberalism and property rights. And when people are invested in their own countries, when they're invested in their own communities, when they own businesses, if you encourage that kind of a culture, it leads people to not want to bomb these buildings. If they don't own something, if people feel like they don't have a stake in their communities, then long term there's no way that you're going to have security because people don't feel invested in it. And so I think that the idea of free market capitalism, laissez-faire, entrepreneurism, these are the ideas that we have to introduce to the people in the Middle East, because I think that's the only way that they're going to feel invested in their own communities.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. But Austin Petersen, editor at the libertarianrepublic.com, thanks so much.
Thank you, Ameera.